Hi, everyone. Um, Over the last 4 years, I've really been interested in conservation and human interaction issues, and I've always been fascinated with whales. So Seaway is kind of the perfect place for me to do that. And besides taking really wonderful classes, I had the opportunity to do work study with Allied Whale and got to do some hands-on field research on the Borealis and Mount Desert Rock. So for my senior project, I decided to look at the impact of fishing gear entanglement with humpback whales using a method called scarification, which I'll go into. Entanglement is a huge problem in the mortality and injury of the endangered humpback whale. As many of you know, the Gulf of Maine is a really productive habitat, and as a result, it's home to some of the largest whale feeding grounds and also some of the largest fisheries in the world, such as the lobster fishery. Now, the lobster fishery uses a type of fixed gear called a pot trap. And if you look at this diagram, it consists of a buoy floating at the surface, which you can see many of if you look out even on Frenchman Bay. And a line goes down to the bottom, and there's floating arcs of gear between each trap. And this gets right into the diving zone of whales, unfortunately. And from 2002 to 2006, there were over 180 documented entanglement reports with humpback whales. But you also have to take this information with a grain of salt, because the only information that we do get about entanglements is from dead whales on the beach and any opportunistic sightings we gathered in the field. One way to solve this problem is by analyzing scars where gear commonly comes into contact with the whale's body. If you look at this diagram, you can see the gear usually gets caught in the mouth, along the flippers, and around the tail. And when you're in the wild, the most common area you're going to see of a humpback whale is its fluke, because it always lifts its tail almost all the time when it dives. And here's kind of an extreme example of an entanglement with a fluke. And on the bottom, you have a fluke with scars around its peduncle. That's this area. And for scarring studies, this is the area of the body that researchers look at. And there's really not that many other things in the ocean that would cause that type of scarring. A previous scarification study in the Gulf of Maine found that 48 to 65% of whales have experienced entanglement in their lifetime. My study was different in that I compared the Gulf of Maine with a different area that didn't have fixed gear. The first area that I picked was the northern Gulf of Maine, not the entire Gulf of Maine, because in Maine there's a controversy with sinking ground line. Sinking ground line is a way to reduce those floating arcs in the water column and have more room for the whales to dive. But Maine's also really rocky. You can look out on the coast, and lobstermen know that the gear will get chafed and broken. So it's really important to analyze this problem because it can affect the livelihood of lobstermen. And the area I compared it to was western Greenland. It has a similar concentration of whales, but dramatically less fixed gear. They have a small crab pot fishery, but nothing compared to this area. So for my project, I went over several hundred photos from both of these regions and looked for scarring on the peduncle here. And as you might have guessed, the northern Gulf of Maine had significantly more evidence of entanglement scarring than whales from Greenland. 46 to 62% of northern Gulf of Maine whales showed evidence of previous scarring, compared to Greenland, which only had a rate about 13%. And here's some examples of what I was looking at over the last few months. This photo, you can see a scar here, and even here. This whale has some deformation, kind of showing where the gear actually pulled through the fluke. And this photo, it's hard to kind of probably tell up on the screen there, but there's some red marks here showing that was kind of a recent entanglement event. So my results suggest that humpbacks are getting entangled far more than is considered sustainable for this population. And one thing I really want to point out that my results don't tell you specifically where whales are getting entangled. Dominique she looked at this problem in a different way, and she actually looked at location events. But what my results do tell you is that I found a specific area with a lot of fixed gear that has a high entanglement rate. And I can also figure out about how much of the population is being affected. Another thing I want to point out is, obviously these whales are surviving entanglement. So maybe they're getting tangled up in gear, but then they get away and they swim free. But it's important to point out that these whales are an endangered species, and there's not a lot of research on how entanglement is impairing locomotion and feeding abilities. So that needs to be looked into. And there was one study that found that females that have been in entanglements before have fewer calves. And the last thing I want to talk about is, here's one of the photos from the catalog, and you can see a clear evidence of entanglement. But for identification purposes, this is all that you need. And that was about half of the photos that I got from my data from Allied Whale. So the best method to actually look at entanglement is to be parallel with the whale. And if this whale was entangled, you would see a scar here and there. And this summer, I'm working as a research assistant on the Bar Harbor Whale Hotch, and I'm hoping to help implement this method of photo taking. And I'm also really hoping to publish my results and present them at the Marine Mammal Conference this year in October. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.